Right behind me is a piggy bank from the 80s. My dad, Raymond, gave me that because for 38 and a half years, he fixed telephones for Ma Bell. He was proud of being the phone man, driving a van exactly like that. He was proud it gave him the ability to provide for our family. We were kind of traditional in Missouri. We played catch, we played contra, beat contra, played tennis, and while my mom and dad got divorced when I was 6 years old, he was involved. We were at his house every other weekend between church services on Sundays. You see right here, Wade's. I would always want to go with him to Wade's. He would take me to breakfast, and I so looked forward to that. And so I wore this shirt in his honor today. I could say for sure my dad was my first idol. You might have had that experience. There is something special and sometimes fraught about father-son relationships. My dad's concept of fatherhood informed my concept in many ways. Some things I want to emulate and other things I want to try something very different because fatherhood changes generation to generation. It is a negotiation. It always has been. Augustine Sedgewick is an author, and his book, Fatherhood, A History of Love and Power, connects the evolving character, you could say, of father and fatherhood through the ages, from Aristotle to St. Augustine to Thomas Jefferson to Norman Rockwell. I hope this exploration of fatherhood, what it's been, what it is, what it could be, hope it makes you think. Augustine, welcome to All Boy.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
I would love to start with the personal because each of us comes to a discussion about fatherhood with our own experiences and preconceptions and hopes, then talk about some of the characters who you profile. I didn't even know that most of these men were fathers. Fascinating profiles. And then end with, I guess, larger themes and hopes for where we can go from here. But let's start with us. You're a dad. What's the experience been like?
That's a great way to start because the book really comes out of my own questions. And although it is a history of fatherhood, its inventions and origins and transformation over time, the story really starts with my own questions.
Yeah.
When my son was born in the summer of 2017, Bill Cosby's mistrial was literally on every TV in the hospital. My earliest memories of the two of us together are from that fall when I would strap him to my chest and walk around our neighborhood, and he would fall asleep and I would scroll endlessly through Me Too stories on my phone. And the questions weren't only in the news. Not long before my son was born, my own father had a stroke that really changed his personality. And in those moments, I found myself with questions of the kind that are not addressed by even the most helpful parenting books. It seemed like the models of fatherhood I had grown up with no longer applied or somehow had been revealed to be hollow. And yet I didn't know where to look for a new model. I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing to connect with this to connect with my child and to connect with my father. And I wanted to think about, well, where did this idea of fatherhood come from in the first place? How has it changed over time? And how might its history help us find a way forward that felt good to all involved?
Fatherhood, I just thought it was. Reading your book, you realize it has evolved. I mean, in many ways, whatever world you're born into, you think it's always going to be this way. To me, I thought the USSR fell. Well, of course, the US is always going to be on top. It's going to be a unipolar world. Like, these things are just a given when you're born into them or you're raised with them. And that is not the case, including with fatherhood. In the last 7-8 years, how has fatherhood changed you?
How has it changed me? Well, I think I have drawn lessons from the work that I've done, the research into its history and origins, but they weren't at all the lessons that I expected or the lessons I was necessarily looking for. I think you make a really good point, which is that we don't really think of fatherhood as having a history. It seems like such a fundamental relationship that we presume that it's always been there and been what it is. That's not at all the case. It's probably true that for most of the history of our species, there was no understanding of reproduction that would have permitted anything like what we our contemporary concept of biological fatherhood. In other words, there was no understanding that there was a one-to-one relationship between an act of sex and pregnancy. Many of the oldest artifacts of human meaning making, many of the oldest artifacts on the human cultural record seem to represent female reproductive power. These are especially a group of kind of small figurines. Together they're called the Venus figurines. They were found across Eurasia and are range from kind of are as old as 50,000 years old and maybe possibly even more. But they have a shared characteristic of large breasts and bellies, and they seem to represent female reproductive power. In contrast, there is nothing whatsoever in the cultural or historical record that would seem to represent fatherhood at that time scale. The oldest phallic images are probably about 10,000 years old, something on the order of 10,000 years old, and yet, by the time of the beginning of the written historical record, about 5,000 years ago, fatherhood is already everywhere. It's in many of the earliest law codes, many of the earliest religious texts. The oldest written documents are dedicated to laying out the power of the fathers. And so the question kind of becomes, well, between 50,000 years ago and 5,000 years ago, what happened? Where did fatherhood come from, and how did it rise to power, such power and importance during that time?
You know, I already referenced real quick why I'm wearing this Wade's shirt. We'd go between church services on Sunday mornings, and I always wanted to go with my dad. I don't care if it was filled with smoke, and I would go in there and eat my pancakes and just be so happy. Real quick, the shirt you're wearing, I see a little art on there. What is it?
Yes, this is also the fatherhood-themed shirt. This is a shirt from a brand called Brooklyn Circus here in Brooklyn. You can see that it's two elephants among other iconography, among other interesting iconography, and it's really inspired by something that my son said to me. I told him once. My son is 7, almost 8 years old. I told him once that he was my favorite child. I tell him that all the time, actually. But once he responded to me, "Well, if you've only seen one elephant, how do you know that that's your favorite elephant?"
He just said that?
He said that. And I said, well, sometimes you just know. And now I tell him that he's my favorite elephant.
and you're the big one and he's the small. That's
I
very
mean,
sweet.
who knows? That's how it is now, but these things change.
You know, my dad, I grew up in Missouri and idolized him. In adolescence, you kind of drift. My stepmom kind of brought us back together on a tennis court, and we bonded again, very close. And then when I got married in 2017, he didn't come to the wedding because of religious reasons, and that so wounded me. And a few months later, I thought, this is not going to be the end of my dad and me. You know, I will not let that be. So I called him. Sometimes the kid has to do that work. And we were very, very close. And I would say, you know, by the time he died in January 2023, I was probably the closest to him out of anybody in the world. And over time, I love him even more because, you know, I know people always say, you know, being a dad, it teaches you how hard it is, so you're more compassionate. To me, that's not what it is. To me, not having children, but being a dad every day, even when it's inconvenient, maybe especially when it's inconvenient, that just tenderizes you in a way to where you love other people more and you're softer. And some people who know me would be like, you're soft, you know, you're pretty damn tough. But I think it has softened me in major ways. And so more and more I love my dad, even when he's not here. What's your experience with your dad?
Well, I want to back up a minute and say thanks for sharing that story. It really is an example of how the father is not always the big elephant, right?
Right.
And that's really consistent with what I did find looking back through the history of fatherhood. You know, I said that from the earliest written texts, from the earliest existing law codes and religious documents, there is, we see fathers adopting this kind of paternal power, this kind of godlike paternal power where they know best, their word is law, and if you follow those laws, then you'll be protected and provided for. That's what we see across millennia, across cultures. And I guess the thing that I was looking for in the history of fatherhood was something other than that. I to research this book, I wrote this book, and about a year ago, I was thinking back on the fathers I had looked at, and I was thinking, well, what lessons can I pull from that will help me find a model of fatherhood that would feel good? And I didn't find anything. I didn't actually think that the history of fatherhood was a particularly good guide to how to be a father. And in that moment, I did one afternoon, my son and I were walking in our neighborhood, and just as we were crossing the busiest street in our neighborhood, an idea occurred to me that I would ask him what he thought a father should be. And he said, without missing a beat, before we even got to the other side of the street, he said that a father should be funny and good at hugging.
Yes.
And I had never thought of a father's job in quite those terms. There was that idea was not anywhere in the history of fatherhood that I had seen it. And what it suggested to me was that historically fathers have been the ones telling and teaching and leading. And what we might do instead is listen to what the people we love are asking us to do and be. And that sounds like what you did with your father, and what I would like to try to do with my son.
With our own dads, it's funny because when we're dads, it's like, okay, now it's my turn. But there is this whole process of resolving, or hopefully stitching closer, if possible, with our own dads. And so, yeah, we can jump to the other characters. As a son, do you feel more whole too? As a dad, it sounds like yes. As a son,
that's a great question. It's true that when I started the book, it was in part to understand my relationship with my father, or I would say to find a new way to connect with my father. He had not long before my son was born, I mentioned he had a stroke that changed his personality. Yes. He had always been very, very solid, very present, very forthright, a source of good advice. And after he had a stroke, he was more withdrawn and in a certain way, and it was hard to square the after with the before in some ways. Yeah. And I think that what researching the history of fatherhood made me understand about my father is to really recognize and celebrate his presence, his the ways that he accompanied me and still accompanies me without having to always, be the one in charge or be the one who knows. And I think, it helped me to celebrate the ways that he has listened and accompanied me, even without having to have all the answers all the time.
Yeah, well, that shows how fatherhood can change generation to generation, and then you are taking the broad view in this book. So let's go back. Aristotle. It seems like in Aristotle's time, paternity, which you were getting at, didn't really seem to matter as much as it maybe, does today. There wasn't a preoccupation of Maury episodes with you are the father, you're not the father. It was kind of I don't know if it was inconsequential. How did that work back then? Mm-hmm.
Well, it's true in ancient Greece that you were the father if you said you were the father. Women created life, but men created legal personhood. After a baby was born, there was a ceremony that would follow the birth by a week or so, where a man would say that he accepts the child into his household, and until that time, the newborn had not existed as a legal person. And if the father or the patriarch did not accept that child into his household, the infant would be what was called exposed, put out, presumably to perish. Excuse me, I lost a AirPod. So it was the father's power to create legal persons. In ancient Greece, fathers were patriarchs. They were heads of households. They were in charge of everything that a household contained. Their family members, although there was no concept of family precisely like ours, their family members, their relations, their property, both land and possession and material possessions, and of course enslaved people who worked in the household. Father had kind of purview over all those aspects of the household. including who was in and who was out.
And so if the nuclear family didn't exist as we know it today, did that inform how you look at nuclear families? Because, for instance, I am a big believer in the effects of two-parent households. If you look at the data, it's just indisputable. We also want our nuclear families surrounded and undergirded by a web of, hopefully family and social programs and things like that. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm a single parent. Mm-hmm. I've always been a single parent. We have a wonderful my son's mother and I have a wonderful relationship. We've been friends for 3 decades.
Co-parent.
We co-parent very effectively and very amicably, and we all have a great time together. I think it is very difficult to be a single parent. There are different sorts of strains and stresses. One thing that I found, one conclusion that I did draw from the history of fatherhood, and is both discouraging and encouraging in a way. And what I saw as I looked back across the history of fatherhood in the West is that if it were just a little easier, if it were just a little less onerous to be a human being in contemporary America, parenthood, especially fatherhood, would be a little easier. I mean, if it weren't a financial catastrophe to get sick or to have a family member who got sick, if it weren't a financial catastrophe to want to educate your children in the most robust possible way, then I think simply removing these two basic human needs of healthcare and education would make it so much easier to inhabit the profoundly human dimensions of the role of parent, would make it so much easier to live in the joy and live in the accompaniment and growth that comes with parenthood.
Well, as my grandpa says, he's 93 years old, he's a preacher, he'll say, that'll preach. And that is true. Childcare, let me add childcare to your list. And
Absolutely.
As you say, having engaged parents is the key. I mean, you look at Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves, which you're familiar with. He says, engaged fatherhood. So again, the parents don't necessarily have to be married. It's that they have an engaged father, better mental health, high school graduation, social skills, literacy, lower risk of teen pregnancy, delinquency, and drug use. So having an engaged dad really matters. And again, Aristotle would not have seen engaged fatherhood the same as we would, but I mean, based on all of history in the study of this book, and then what we know and experience ourselves today, is there a reckoning, or is it just like, okay, things have changed?
A reckoning of...
a dad cannot simply be this towering figure who just points out, this person's in, this person's out, you matter, you don't. That actually having him there on the ground, going to games, which is very time consuming and money consuming and emotionally draining many times, trying to get your kids everywhere. I mean, modern fatherhood, and honestly, a bunch of moms are probably listening, rolling their eyes, being like, we've been doing this. You guys are just onto this now. But, it's a lot. And I think a lot of people wonder, what is the best mode?
It is a lot. And the truth is that it's always been a lot. And I think men have promised, and the reason it's a lot is that men have promised a lot. I mean, across millennia, across cultures, men have promised to protect and provide. They've said, I know best for you. If you do what I say, you will be protected and you'll be provided for. Now, that's a theme across the history of fatherhood. That presents a problem for whoever is making those promises, because it's a godlike promise that mortals cannot completely fulfill. At some point, protection is going to fall short, provision is going to run out, someone is going to get hurt, someone's going to get sick, someone is going to die. That is the name of the game when it comes to mortal beings. So men have constantly made these promises, and those promises have constantly kind of slipped away from them. I think that often, because of those those very weighty, godlike promises are built into or loaded into our historical and cultural conceptions of fatherhood, when we do fall short of them, sometimes that feels like a personal failure. And men kind of carry that especially heavily. It's not a personal failure to not be able to entirely protect and provide for the people you care about most. That's just what it means to be a human being. Right? And so if there were an understanding of care and love that were more
forgiving.
Forgiving is a great word for it. I think we again could be more open to living in the really profound and transformative parts of parenthood, the joyful parts, without kind of carrying so heavily the unfulfillable expectations and impossible promises that have come down to us across time.
When you talk about making those promises, though, I mean, people might have read your other books, and you're a noted historian, and you can connect dots throughout time and space. Although I should say, your book is really fun to read too. It's just bursting full of great, colorful characters. But I mean, watch The Lion King. The big, strong man is the one who leads, and again, it's everyone surrounding them who does get protection, who gets provision. And that is kind of, I don't know, it's not even just human beings. So is it right you didn't call it a construct, but is it right to call it a construct or an invention when that just seems to exist in animals, period?
Well, I think that the reason it exists in, cultural...
Tell me I'm wrong, please. You're the expert here.
Well, there's something to that. I wouldn't say that Disney films or even Pixar films necessarily, although wonderful as they may be, are necessarily the best guide to how nature is organized and therefore a model for how we should organize human societies. I mean, I think that one thing that makes human beings special animals is our storytelling capacity. We are the storytelling animal. And one reason that fatherhood is so important in human culture, far more important than it is in any other animal culture, especially when it comes to our closest primate relatives, human beings, there's only a small minority of animals that provide any paternal care whatsoever, and no animal comes close to the amount of paternal care that humans provide. The reason, I think, that fact, the human uniqueness in terms of the amount of and nature of paternal care provided, is very much related to our uniqueness as storytellers. Human beings are the fatherhood animal because they are the storytelling animal. I think men have told stories about fatherhood to support their social prominence, and perhaps especially because the importance of women in the creation and sustenance of life is so vividly clear. Now, I will say that the word father is based on this sound, pa, fa, da, ta, common across cultures. And linguists have theorized that babies make this sound. They apply this sound to the first thing that they recognize outside of themselves, which is not how babies are thought to hear their mothers. Okay? We hear that sound, fa, pa, da, ta, as a request for help, right? Because apparently, evolutionary biologists think that it activates a part of our brains that first evolved in male fish, who were recruited to guard eggs that were fertilized and would hatch outside the mother's body, right? So there is a deep evolutionary nature to taking care of one another.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I don't think that necessarily means that what form that care can take. The forms that care takes is shaped by the stories that we tell about who we are, where we come from, and what it means to be a person and to love and be loved.
Yeah.
And I think our special capacity of human beings, as human beings, is to understand the most humane, let's say, way to take care of each other and to love and be loved. And men have historically made that sound, fa, pa, da, ta, mean all these things. They've made it mean God, they've made it mean king, they've made it mean founder, inventor, leader. They've made it mean history itself. But before men made it those things, it came from a fish who was asked to help. So
How?
I think what we could do as fathers is not tell everyone how we can help them all the time, but listen to how we are being asked to help by the people we love and who love us.
The fish story, a lot of us talk about our lizard brain or whatever, but that it's actually a fish brain that is calling us to take care of people. So fascinating. And in the book, let's speed up in time. You talk about St. Augustine, who he helped, form this idea of original sin and being able to protect your progeny for all eternity, really, by baptizing them. And I'm a Catholic, so I like that part, even though maybe, it's you're not exactly endorsing what he said. And you also talk about Henry VIII, which I didn't realize had a son. And yet went through all of this hoopla about having a male heir. Could you share that briefly? It's often an overlooked part of Henry VIII's story. And during the whole time he was trying to father an heir and get a divorce and get another divorce, and as a way to father an heir who would sustain his dynasty, he actually already had a son. This boy was named Henry Fitzroy, which means Henry, son of the king. In effect, he was named after his father, Henry VIII, twice. And but the boy was, by the rules of the day, which were largely church rules, but also rules of the nobility, the boy was illegitimate. Yeah.
Illegitimacy was kind of a new phenomenon at that time that had come in part from church law, but also from the rules of nobility. In ancient history, for example, in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, it was entirely within the power of the father to designate an heir. This happened all the time in the ancient world. The father could say who was in and who was out. But the rise of the Catholic Church and the rise of Christian morality to define the boundaries of the church, as well as the laws of inheritance that came along with the tradition of landed nobility, they ended that. They said that it's the church, marriage is a sacrament. Baptism is a sacrament. There are all these rites that make a family legitimate and eligible to live forever in heaven with their real father, God. The church, in effect, took power away from patriarchs and gave it to God the Father. Henry VIII was trying, in effect, to claim back some of the power of the patriarch from the church. And he found an unlikely ally in Martin Luther. Martin Luther said, of course, priests are false fathers. Parents are the real fathers. And for Martin Luther, it was the job of the father not only to care for children and change dirty diapers and things like this, but also to interpret the Bible at home. So for Martin Luther's program, his protest against the Catholic Church, helped to aid Henry VIII's quest to take some of the power back from Rome, back from priests, back from church law, and claim again the power to determine who was in and who was out. As Henry VIII sought for himself that power, he actually granted it to men across Europe. He helped men across Europe gain this incredibly powerful tool to decide inheritance by will rather than by law. In other words, fathers again could say who was in and who was out.
You use the word authority. I wondered what you meant by that exactly, because in your book you talk about love and power, and I mean, power and authority are not always synonymous, as we know, and there are authoritarian models of parenting. Being an authority figure, that's important in a family. You know, a kid needs someone who is an authority, who creates boundaries. Authoritative parenting, they find again and again, is the most successful form of parenting and outcomes of kids, that you love them, but you have high expectations. And so how did you come down on that after researching all of this? Because fathers are authorities, and you do need them to be an authority figure.
Oh, well, that's a big statement. I'm not sure I can. First
Well,
of all, what do you mean?
laissez-faire parenting or authoritarian parenting, out of Berkeley and stuff, longitudinal studies, the kids don't fare as well if they don't have an authority figure. Again, not someone who has an iron fist and says, this is a monarchy, not a democracy or whatever. But kids do need authority figures, and in the home, a dad or two dads or two moms or a mom and a dad or whatever, they are that authority figure, right? Or tell me, again, if you disagree with me, please.
It's hard to know. Well, so when I say authority in the book, I'm talking about what authorizes the instructions that you're giving as legitimate. What's the seat of your legitimacy? What kind of justifies the power that you claim? So the seat of fatherly authority changes over time. For Aristotle, it was nature. For St. Augustine, it was God, I believe. For Henry VIII, as we discussed, it was King himself. So the changes of fatherly authority the source of fatherly authority changes over time.
I see. So you're talking more philosophically, like from whence your authority comes, rather than just, exerting some authority.
Right.
Okay.
But these are the platforms from which we claim power. These are the justifications for the instructions that we give. What's the basis for our authority? So that changes dramatically over time, as the book describes. As far as prescribing models of authority, I do think again that although surely the parents rather than children are quote unquote in charge at home, right? I think what I'm trying to move toward myself is a fatherhood less of telling and more of listening, not only of teaching but also of learning.
Yes. Okay. But I don't think that's incompatible. And I don't know. To me, that's not incompatible at all, that you are the one, setting the boundaries and enforcing the rules, which honestly, I tell my kids sometimes, I do not enjoy this. I don't like timeout. I am not enjoying this at all, but we're going to do it, but I also listen and I tell them when I'm wrong, and I tell them I'm sorry when I'm wrong. But at the end of the day, I think they know Dad is the one in charge. So anyway, I never thought about, is this a natural divine right of mine to be the authority figure? More so just thinking kids need someone to be an authority figure. A classroom full of kids with no authority figure in the form of a teacher, it's a romper room,
I don't know. I suppose I know that that's true of college also. It's true of all forms of gathering. It's true of adults for sure. I mean, I think that's probably true of all forms of. I don't even know. Maybe there are other forms of authority that are more horizontal, but certainly, whatever form that takes in different families is okay with me. I think I'm more interested in thinking about as far as like parenting how-tos, I'm more interested in thinking about, well, how can I create the kind of family, how can I create the kind of home that feels good for me and my son? And the truth is I don't think I know what feels good for other people, or I don't presume to know what other people should do to create that kind of home for themselves. but I do have an idea about what I would like to try and what we are trying, and that other people can try too if they feel like they'd like to.
Is it kind of like Dr. Becky, Good Inside? You might have read that book. It's known as gentle parenting. It's kind of, again, trying to understand how they're feeling in that moment and processing with them that it is this symbiotic or reciprocal communication style, that it's not about discipline or something like that. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I don't know Dr. Becky, but I would say that it strikes me
on Instagram. She has millions of followers. You gotta look her up.
Well, I'm not on Instagram, but I would say that especially when we're talking about young men and boys, it does feel like being able to talk through what's happening inside your mind and emotions is a really important skill to learn.
Very.
And it happens to be that my son is really good at that. He has a lot of insight about what's happening, and I am always encouraging him to share that. And it seems like when we do, we find our balance and symbiosis very easily. And I think I would say that that's one thing that I think men more generally, boys more generally, could definitely try to work on. It's sharing how you feel, sharing what you think, sharing what you're worried about and scared of is such an important part of loving and being loved. I do really think that's an important thing that I would like to show and my son and to bring out in him.
My gosh, yes. I had Dr. Michael Thompson on. He's a clinical psychologist who focuses on boys. And a big part of his movement has been ask them how they're feeling. When a little girl is having a meltdown on the playground, you often ask her what happened. Little boys, you often tell them, stop, get up. And you don't ask them, how are you feeling? What happened? And I've really tried to implement that with my kids. And sometimes they don't care. But a lot of times I realize there's something deeper that they will tell you about, that kind of what you're getting at, that it's not simply about black or white, get over it, whatever. That you need to actually take time to invest emotionally with them, to teach them to work up that muscle too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you have to work on it on your own self too. Yeah. You have to work on the listening as a father, as a parent. Right. Okay,
so Norman Rockwell, I had no clue what was going on behind the scenes in these paintings. And, so many of us have idealized those scenes. I was actually out in West Virginia this weekend, and I saw they had Rockwell paintings all over the wall in this place I went. And I thought, oh, wouldn't that be nice? And domestic bliss, and this man sitting there drinking tea with his wife. And it turns out his relationship with his wife was really fraught, messed up. I don't know what to call it. Mm-hmm. The family had all these issues. And I guess you mentioned Bill Cosby earlier. I was thinking, growing up, if someone were to ask me, who would you want to be your dad from pop culture? I would have said Cliff Huxtable. Mm-hmm. I loved Cliff Huxtable. I thought that family, Brooklyn, and I thought I want to live in that brownstone. I want to dance on that banister, with the kids. And there's oftentimes something more going on in people's lives, which this illustrates really well in your book. We talked about power, love. It actually is the first word, love and power. How have you come to think about dads and love? Because so many times they were this sturdy, silent oak. And not Stoic philosophy, but Stoicism was the rule of the day with a lot of these guys. And there was so much more inside than they ever got to let out. And do you feel like we're on the right path to being able to show our boys love?
Well, maybe fathers of the past have been silent, but I would not say they've been especially sturdy. I think both of those examples, Norman Rockwell and Bill Cosby, point that up. Those are two particularly grim examples, but I think they speak to this larger paradox where our public stories about fatherhood tend to be a bit simplistic. They fathers tend to play these really well-defined roles. Either they're heroes or villains, they're clowns, or they're fools. But those are our public stories about fatherhood. Our private stories about fatherhood, like the one you shared earlier, like the one, like my own, are much more complex than that. And I think the difference between the public images and the private realities does create a tension in the lives of men, where if you're not living up to the Norman Rockwell or Huxtable ideal, then you've done something. If there's been a personal failing, you've done something wrong. I think we need stories about fatherhood, about family life, that are more open to complexity, the reality of the fragility of success and life, and that are more, I think you said, forgiving and generous. I think that at the moment we're at another time in history when we are looking for viable models of what fatherhood and masculinity should be like. I think your podcast is an example of the types of discussions that are ongoing that ask these really important questions about who do we want to be. The reason why those questions are so compelling and so important is that we're kind of looking for the answer together. Right?
Yeah.
I don't know where we'll end up, but I think the way that those questions have risen to the forefront again suggests a lot of possibility.
This is the most simplistic thing of all, but don't you love being a dad? I love being a dad.
Loving and being loved is a transformative experience. It's a profound experience of growth and joy and all of the deepest things. I think if we were to develop a model of fatherhood, manhood, masculinity more generally, that would allow us to inhabit those experiences more fully without, snagging on our own fears of not protecting and not providing in the kind of the way that has encouraged us to be silent and not always so solid, then I think that more people would share your feelings about being a father. It's a transformative, it's a profound transformative experience. I think loving and being loved are those things most generally. I think parenthood is one place where we very often find them.
Augustine, you've brought up masculinity a few times, which is very much a hot discussion right now of what is masculinity, what is acceptable, what is ideal. We've talked about it here on the show. Zach Seidler from Movember, if people want to check that out. But another conversation going on right now is about who this book was written for instance, The Economist. I wanted to see if you wanted to respond to this, because I'm assuming you thought about this, the class divide when it comes to fatherhood. That The Economist wrote, whereas college-educated dads in America are spending more time with their children, their less educated peers are spending slightly less than they did 20 years ago. They are also far more likely to live apart from their kids and hardly see them at all. How did you think about the class divides in our country, which is fueling a lot of the unrest politically as well, as it pertains to fatherhood?
Mm-hmm. It is. I think the parenthood is punishingly expensive. It really is, and especially providing your children with all those things that they need to be a successful person in our place and time is really just punishingly expensive. I think that's a really significant issue for me. It does come back to this idea that, well, if it weren't so financially devastating to have basic human needs in this country, then we could inhabit a very different parenthood. If it weren't financially devastating to need to live in a house, to have health care, to get education.
And most people want to have more kids than they have, actually, but they can't afford it.
I certainly cannot afford. I find in living in New York, I
York
find
City.
one to be an extraordinarily high number of children. Absolutely, our fruit snack budget is just out of control. So yeah,
Fresh fruit is, oh my gosh. I'm like, how many raspberries? Okay, one less raspberry there. You really think about it.
You have to ration it. It's punishingly expensive, and I think that's a real issue that affects different people very differently based on how they work and what they have, and it absolutely, it is a critically important issue to address.
Yeah.
I would propose starting with such things as public health care, public education, but that requires systemic political transformations that I alone am not capable of making. So
Right. Well, I was going to finish in that zone with you to ask about recommended policy changes and things like that. You mentioned education, childcare, healthcare, and you talked about the ideal father. He doesn't exist, obviously. Some people might feel God the Father, but not everyone is, of that belief. Here on earth, is there anyone that after all of this and all of the very complex and sometimes messed up fathers you profile, that today or in the past you think, he was kind of onto something? Wasn't perfect, but he's onto something.
My recommendation to men is to ask the people they love and who love them what those people need us as fathers and men to be and do. Right? Your ideal father, the ideal father for your family, is something that your family can help you find. Ask the people you love what they want you to do and be. What they need you to do and be. That is the ideal father for them.
Augustine Sedgewick, I really enjoyed your book, Fatherhood, A History of Love and Power. And if anything else, you kind of sometimes read these stories and think, all right, I'm not so bad. I'm not so bad, which all of us need that little pep every once in a while. And thanks for putting this out.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for your questions. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on fatherhood after that discussion? What is essential to being a good dad? What's negotiable or even maybe expendable at this point? I do this podcast because, honestly, just because I love my sons, I want all of our boys to get a fair shot at a full and happy life. And while clearly fatherhood has changed over time, as Augustine just pointed out, and maybe for the better, dads, we have a key role to play. Ask your son to go to breakfast. Look at my 35 years later, I can tell you he will not forget that. Ask him how he is. You'll be more connected. You will never regret that. Follow Allboy on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Substack. The website is allboyallgood.com. I'm Chance Seales. See you soon.